I used to believe that staying was the noble choice. That endurance meant strength. That loyalty, even when it hurt, was something to be proud of. I told myself that real adults didn't run, didn't quit, didn't abandon people just because things became uncomfortable. So I stayed. I stayed when the room felt smaller every year. I stayed when conversations became repetitions instead of connections. I stayed when my own thoughts started sounding foreign, like they belonged to someone I used to know. If you had asked me back then whether I was unhappy, I would have said no. Not because it was true but because I didn't have the language for what I was feeling. I wasn't miserable. I was erased slowly. There's a quiet kind of suffering that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't cry or scream. It just waits patiently while you make compromises that seem reasonable in isolation. One compromise turns into another. Another into a habit. And eventually, you look at your life and realize it's built entirely out of just this once. I told myself I was being responsible. That other people needed me. That my role mattered more than my comfort. Every choice I made was defensible. Sensible. Logical. And that's how I lost myself, not in chaos, but in order. The first sign should have been my mornings. I woke up already tired. Not physically, emotionally. Like my soul had been awake all night negotiating with reality and lost. I moved through routines flawlessly, mechanically. I knew exactly what was expected of me and delivered it with precision. Everyone trusted me. No one worried about me. That's the danger of being reliable. People stop checking if you're okay because you always are. Except I wasn't. I noticed it in small moments. Standing in the shower, staring at the tiles, unable to remember what I was thinking about seconds earlier. Sitting in conversations, hearing my own voice respond automatically while my mind drifted somewhere else entirely. Sometimes I would catch myself imagining a different life, not a better one, just quieter. One where no one needed anything from me. One where my absence wouldn't create inconvenience. Those thoughts scared me, so I buried them under responsibility. Years passed like that. Quietly. Efficiently. Respectably. From the outside, my life looked stable. Predictable. Earned. From the inside, it felt like a long hallway with no doors. I stayed in relationships that no longer saw me, because leaving would hurt someone. I stayed in routines that drained me, because changing them would disrupt others. I stayed silent about my dissatisfaction, because it felt selfish to speak. Every time I thought about choosing myself, guilt answered faster. What about them? What about everything you've built? What kind of person walks away after all this time? So I stayed. Until one evening, sitting alone at the kitchen table, I realized I couldn't remember the last decision I had made purely because I wanted to, not because it was right. Not because it was expected. But because it was mine. That realization didn't break me immediately. It sank in slowly, like cold water. I started noticing how often I said yes when my body wanted to say no. How often I explained myself internally for choices no one had questioned. How my life had become a series of reactions instead of intentions. The most painful part wasn't the sacrifice. It was the invisibility. I had given so much of myself that there was nothing left distinct enough to be seen. And the worst truth, the one I avoided for years, was this: no one had forced me to stay. I chose it. Every day. Out of fear, obligation, and a mistaken belief that self-erasure was the price of being good. By the time I understood that, I was already disappearing, not physically, but internally. And once that process begins, it doesn't stop on its own. The collapse didn't happen in one moment. It never does. It came in fragments. In hesitations. In a growing delay between what I felt and what I allowed myself to acknowledge. I began to dread questions that required honesty. How are you? What do you want? Are you happy? They all felt like traps. Not because the answers were complicated but because they were simple, and unacceptable. I wasn't fine. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. And happiness felt like something I had opted out of years ago without realizing it. There was a strange contradiction inside me. I was dependable, composed, calm. People came to me with their problems, trusted my judgment, leaned on my stability. I gave good advice. I listened well. I was present for everyone else. And yet, when it came to my own life, I felt like a bystander. I watched myself make decisions as if someone else were holding the pen. At some point, I stopped expressing preferences. It felt easier that way. Less friction. Less explanation. I told myself I was flexible, mature, easygoing. In reality, I was shrinking. I remember one specific moment, insignificant on the surface, devastating underneath. Someone asked me what I wanted to do that weekend. Anything. No obligations. No expectations. My mind went blank. Not because I was overwhelmed with options but because I had lost access to desire. I stood there, silent, embarrassed by how empty the question felt. That silence followed me everywhere after that. I noticed how often I apologized for existing. For taking up time. For having opinions. For needing rest. I noticed how my inner voice had changed, how it no longer encouraged, only corrected. Don't be difficult. Don't disappoint anyone. Don't make this about you. Those phrases ran on repeat, so familiar I no longer questioned them. Sleep became shallow. I woke up in the middle of the night with a sense of pressure in my chest, like something important was overdue. Sometimes I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to pinpoint what was wrong. There was never a single answer, just a long list of things I hadn't allowed myself to want. The breaking point arrived disguised as responsibility. A situation arose where everyone assumed I would step in. Solve it. Carry it. Absorb the inconvenience. I felt the familiar reflex, the automatic yes forming before I could stop it. And suddenly, something inside me refused. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just, firmly. For the first time in years, I felt anger. Clean, sharp anger, not at anyone else, but at myself. At how predictably I had made myself available for erasure. I heard myself say no. The word hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. The reaction was immediate. Surprise. Confusion. Subtle disappointment masked as concern. Questions wrapped in politeness. Are you sure? This doesn't sound like you. We were counting on you. Each sentence landed like an accusation. And there it was, the moral dilemma I had avoided my entire adult life. If I chose myself, someone else would be inconvenienced. Possibly hurt. Possibly let down. If I stayed silent and complied, I would continue disappearing. There was no option that didn't cost something. That realization broke the illusion I had been living under, that self-sacrifice was endless and consequence-free. That you could keep giving without ever running out. I realized I had already run out, I just hadn't told anyone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat alone and allowed myself to think something forbidden. What if staying is the wrong choice? Not leaving dramatically. Not burning bridges. Just, changing direction. Reclaiming space. Redefining myself in ways that might disappoint others. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. I had built my identity around being needed. If I stopped being that person, who would I become, and worse, who would I be to them? There's a particular terror in realizing that people love you for what you provide, not for who you are, and that you helped build that dynamic willingly. I understood then that my exhaustion wasn't from doing too much. It was from being someone I no longer recognized. And the most dangerous thought followed naturally: if I don't change now, I never will. That thought didn't feel empowering. It felt like standing at the edge of something irreversible. Because choosing yourself late in life doesn't feel like growth, it feels like betrayal. Betrayal of expectations. Of shared history. Of the version of you everyone is comfortable with. But there was another betrayal I could no longer ignore. The one I had committed quietly, daily, against myself. After that night, something in me went silent. Not in the way panic goes silent before it explodes, but in the way a decision settles once it's already been made. I didn't feel brave. I didn't feel liberated. I felt heavy, grounded by the weight of a truth I could no longer negotiate with. I stopped explaining myself in advance. I stopped softening my words to protect reactions I could not control, and for the first time in my life, I allowed disappointment to exist without immediately trying to fix it. That alone changed everything. People noticed. Not because I announced anything, but because absence is louder than protest. I was still there, physically, but something essential had shifted. I no longer volunteered to disappear. At first, the resistance was subtle. Confusion disguised as concern. Jokes meant to pull me back into familiar patterns. Gentle reminders of who I used to be. Each reminder felt like an invitation to betray myself again. And this time, I refused. The consequences were immediate and unavoidable. Some relationships grew tense. Some became quiet. Some revealed fractures I had been holding together for years without realizing it. That was one of the hardest lessons. Not everything that falls apart was healthy to begin with. I mourned those losses quietly. Not with anger, but with grief. Grief for the illusion that I could change without cost. That I could reclaim myself and remain unchanged in everyone else's eyes. You can't choosing yourself late doesn't look heroic. It looks awkward. Uncomfortable. Sometimes selfish. There were days I questioned everything. Days when guilt returned full force, whispering that I had overcorrected. That I had become cold. That I was abandoning people who had once relied on me. But each time I considered going back, I felt the same familiar suffocation. That was how I knew the choice was real. I began rebuilding my life not with ambition, but with honesty. I asked myself small questions instead of grand ones. What do I enjoy when no one is watching? What drains me? What am I willing to let go of? The answers weren't dramatic. They were human. I learned that peace is not the absence of conflict, it's the absence of self-betrayal. That boundaries aren't punishments, they're instructions on how to treat me without erasing me. Some people adapted. Others didn't. Both outcomes were information. The quietest victory was internal. I started waking up without that familiar dread. Not excited, just present. Whole enough to feel my own weight in the world. Whole enough to make decisions that aligned instead of appeased. I stopped measuring my worth by usefulness. I stopped apologizing for needing rest. I stopped mistaking endurance for virtue. The life I live now isn't louder or more impressive than the one before. It doesn't look revolutionary from the outside. But it's mine in a way it never was before. And that makes all the difference. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, the exhaustion, the quiet resentment, the constant self-erasure, understand this: you don't owe your disappearance to anyone. Staying is only noble if it doesn't require you to vanish. Sacrifice is only meaningful if it's chosen, not assumed. And love that demands your silence is not love. It's convenience. I stayed for everyone else. And I almost lost myself. Almost, because the moment I chose to stop disappearing, even imperfectly, even late, I began to exist again.